indie artists, you're not in the pharmaceutical industry. You're in the black market. Buy a bag and start selling it.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 301, and we're going to be talking about markets and the music industry, the music business, capitalism, and some comparisons between the music industry and other industries.
Yeah.
I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me is my co-pilot, Circa. Circa, I'm very excited about this episode, my friend.
I'm excited too. Excited to go over it.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting one. Comparing the music industry, the music business, and marketing that goes on within it to other industries is something that we get into a lot on this podcast. You'll often hear us comparing, you'll hear me waxing poetic about like, this is how music is similar to nonprofits, or this is how music is similar to the local business or the coffee shop or the pizza shop on your corner. But I don't think we've ever discussed the market of music as it compares to crime and related markets around crime. So, Cirque, without further ado, let's kick this episode off and talk about music marketing and selling drugs.
Yeah, let's do it, man. I'm an open book, just whatever you'd like to know. But yeah, we kind of started this off with when we were talking about this episode is that like drawing a comparison between the two, because in a lot of ways, the record industry is the opposite of the drug industry. And they're also striking similarities. So it's kind of interesting.
So it's funny that you say that, because I think, and we didn't intend to necessarily go down this path, but when we talk about the drug industry, we can talk about the pharmaceutical industry, which actually might be a little bit more like the music industry as it currently exists. And we can talk about the illegal buying and selling of drugs.
The black market.
Yeah, the black market in a country like the United States, for example. And maybe we can get into a little bit of the different similarities and differences between those two. But what was the genesis for this idea in your head? Because I know you said this has been sitting in your ideas topics list for a while now.
When you come up with topics for content, you want to choose something that's a bit incendiary. Also, in comedy, they teach you that you're really, as a comedian, you're boring until you can learn to talk about sort of what makes you different, what makes you interesting. And so combining those two ethos, I don't think it's generally well known that I grew up as a vagrant criminal from a broken home. So, our audience, I don't think is aware of that.
You said it, not me.
I don't think our audience is very much aware of that. So I just thought it was a cool intersection, a catchy headline, something people might pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a fun one. Let's dive into it. What would you say? Man, there's so much that we could go into here.
First question, what?
Yeah. There's so much that we could talk about here, but I want to dive right into maybe some definitions and a bit of economics discussion about the ideas of supply and demand and how they apply to music and the music business and how they apply to drugs, because maybe that's a good foundation for us to start this discussion about what goes on in those different industries and how players within them operate.
Yeah. So supply and demand, supply is obviously the amount of a given commodity or item that's available for purchase. And demand is the amount of market participants who wish to buy said commodity or item. And they have an interesting relationship. In economics in college, or, maybe in AP high school, you would learn that price is the variable between the two. So as supply goes up or as demand goes down, or both, price should also go down. As supply goes down and demand goes up, price should also go up. But there's also other considerations. There's like volume. There is time. Time is a definite factor between the two. It's a bit more complicated. Just say that like when there is a limited supply and a high demand, prices should generally go up. Items should not be on the market for long. They should disappear quite quickly. And when the inverse is true, you expect items to spend a long time on the market before they're purchased. And so, yeah, maybe that's helpful in the discussion as we go forward.
For sure, yeah. I think an easy picture to think about when you think about supply and demand curves, probably if you've never thought about this concept before or heard of this concept, you can think about real estate, how houses get more expensive and more or less of them are available for people to buy and sell at a given time, and prices fluctuate as the market adjusts accordingly. That's probably an easy picture that everyone can, look down their street at, especially right now. Real estate market's really weird, but because it's maybe not as easy or is a little more opaque to think about supply and demand as it pertains to you and your music or selling drugs.
Yeah. Black markets are hyper-capitalist. There are, capitalism is the belief generally that the best way to govern a populace is to let market forces like supply and demand determine what is right. We're all generally compensated for our labor and our efforts in terms of, currencies. And we all generally spend those currencies on the basis of what we find to be the best product. And so, so much of the law is property, so much of the law is commerce and markets. And so hyper-capitalists tend to believe that like any laws that mess with capitalism screw it up, right? That if left to its own devices, markets would find the optimal solution for everything. And it's a compelling argument because once you get down to the raw mathematics of markets, capitalism presumes that everyone does what they want to do on their own volition. And so, you wouldn't buy something if you didn't want it. You wouldn't sell something if you did want it. And you wouldn't accept a payment rate that you find unacceptable. If you weren't actually willing to do X work for Y, amount of dollars, then you wouldn't do it. And so as long as there's no force, then markets should kind of figure everything out. Black markets, drug markets are insanely hyper-capitalist because there's no rules, right? There's no rules. Nobody's following the law. And so the law actually can't really intervene in drug markets unless, the police catch a drug dealer or something like that. So,
right.
Yeah.
There are truly no regulations in a black market.
Right. Yeah. There are no, people do not behave on the basis of assumed regulations, at least not between market participants. So drug buyers don't necessarily treat drug dealers differently because drugs are illegal and vice versa.
Imagine that world.
Yeah.
Imagine a world that wasn't like that.
Yeah. So that's a lot of preamble just to get into the conversation of sort of, I have experience in black markets growing up how I did, and they give me sort of a unique entry into business in general, and probably contributed to why I found the music industry so weird.
So let's talk about that a little bit. When we're looking at black markets like drug markets as hyper-capitalist, how does that compare to the market of music as we see it today in 2023? Before we were rolling, we were talking about how these ideas are kind of opposite of one another. While they might have some similarities and discussion points that we can talk to, they're largely almost polar opposites.
Yeah. So if you are a normie, if you are someone who's not engaged in the business world already, then the general presumption when someone decides they want to start a business, they think of a list of legal registrations that they probably have to perform. They don't think about, I'm going to get a product, I'm going to offer that product to a market and see if they buy it. They don't think about inventory, offers, and sales. They think about registering my LLC, getting a trademark,
website,
getting some kind of business certificate with your local government. Like they think about all these regulatory items rather than the raw supply and demand transactional problems. If you think about the music industry,
yeah,
it's that on steroids, right?
It falls right into that. How often do we find ourselves answering questions about like, okay, so before I release my music, I should probably copyright it, right?
Copyright it, trademark my band name. I should then file with, 8 different 3-letter agencies to ensure that I'll get money from my copyrighted works. Capitalism is tamped down in the music industry because there is an intense amount of regulation around our industry. And it all centers around the idea of intellectual property. So before we can actually transact in our commodity, which is music, we first have to give it this government regulation, this regulatory power that says it's property. Because before that, it's not property. It's just like an idea, right? So we have to protect ourselves in that way, which, how do I say this? Like, let's say that I have a pound of weed, right? Let's say that. Immediately my thought is like, where are people who smoke marijuana? I'll go find them and hopefully they'll buy it from me, right? If I have a folder full of songs, immediately my thought is someone's going to try to steal this from me. And so I had better lock it down and protect it maximally. And then not can I go find people who might like this music to then buy it from me, but how can I get a larger entity interested in my product so that they can then license it out from me and mostly, own it. They basically virtually own it so that they can then transact with end customers, which is very odd. And it's also, when we turn our ideas into property, what ends up happening is that we sign over those property rights to someone else. It would be like if I'm a heroin dealer and I have a bunch of heroin, right? And I go and I decide, there are lots of people who want this and I could probably go sell it. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to guarantee 80% revenue share with some other drug dealer down the street. And then since they're already in it, they know it better than I do. So I'm just going to do that. And then I'll just take my little 20% profit share. That's a weird thing to do in a hyper-capitalist market, which is sort of why the argument is that the music industry is heavily regulated and it massively distorts the free market principles of the industry.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is an interesting path to start walking down, especially when you started talking about, okay, I've got a pound of weed and I'm going to go find people who want it. But if I have a folder of songs or even a stack of records, I'm going to go through the processes of making sure that it's quote unquote mine, before I try to do anything real with it. And then when I try to do something real with it, it's, can I find a suitable partner to license it on my behalf and give it to other people, as opposed to, can I just take this music and go find people that want it? Can I go, sling these CDs out of the back of my trunk, which isn't something unusual from, days past, how people would sell records, long ago.
Yeah. Before there was I'll say this, right? A lot of artists got screwed over in the early Wild West days of the record industry. The reason they got screwed over is because regulations weren't as tight, but that also made it much easier and more straightforward to start a business. You take an artist down to the nearest studio, you then print up wax and you sell the wax, right? That's it. It was a lot more run and gun like that. I think that for artists, finding people who might want to buy the product is way down there on the list of priorities.
Yeah.
Artists want fans, sure. They want people to like their music and they know they got to get fans to entertain some form of partner. So fans are kind of a priority, but actually selling their product is not really a priority.
Yeah. It's interesting. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had conversations over the years with bands and artists who, even when they are working on the priority of selling to their fans, of trying to get more fans, when asked about what else is going on and what they might be working on at a time, the first thing that often gets mentioned to me is yeah, man, we're hunting down the deal. We're waiting for that phone call. Not oh, we just stocked up our whole store and we're ready to do a huge launch, and we're going to try to turn all of our customers into repeat customers, or we're going to try to find a whole new batch of fans by, XYZ unique mechanism. It's, just we're waiting for the right phone call, message, email, contract. It's that. That's so often the first thing that you hear.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So, most participants in the music industry, they do not have an excess demand. They are not experiencing a business as one experiences it when the supply demand curve is completely tilted to one side. They don't have much supply. They also don't have much demand. They're in a tough spot, most of the participants in the music industry. But you can see the effects both in the drug trade and in the music industry. You can see the effects of what happens to vendors, to dealers, once they have a commodity that has a fixed supply or a low supply, but an insanely outsized demand for the supply that they have. What happens is, and anyone who was like a marijuana user before it became mostly legal around the country might remember, is that when you were a weed dealer, you take your sweet ass time getting around to selling the weed. Right. I remember like being like 14 and waiting like literal days for someone to show up at my house. Right. There is a lax attitude towards actually moving the product because they're certain that it will be moved. There is no problem there and they can take their sweet ass time.
If you don't like it, there's another customer.
Exactly. There's no thought given to like, well, if I were able to move my supply sooner, I could then get new supply sooner, and thereby I could increase the transactions per, day or week, and then I would be making more money per week. There's no thought given to that. And that same thing happens with large artists. They have an outsized demand, they can afford to be lazy, and so they're not thinking about maximizing transaction volume in a time period. They're thinking about like, what do I want to do? What sounds cool? They're not at all thinking about how to get the most out of their demand while they have it.
Yeah.
And so, it's an interesting parallel is drawn there where like 1% of the whole like vendor space has insane demand for their product and they're not willing to fulfill. It's the same with the black market.
Yeah. That's the big similarity in these very different markets. That is the big similarity.
Yeah.
It's the 1% that we talk about so often, and we see this all the time with major artists, that the desire to pick up the money that's left on the table in whatever revenue stream it might be. We talk about e-commerce all the time and selling merch online, and that's the biggest missed opportunity. Sure. But how many others are there? Tons, depending on which artist you're talking to or which band you're looking at. Is like, okay, like this artist probably could be doing stuff with Sync, but they're not. This artist probably could be doing more touring, but they're not. Like, you can see this sort of across the board. It's because they don't have to that they don't, instead of because you can, you should.
Yeah, it's a natural consequence of outsized demand is that the best vendors, the best participants in the market will expand their capacity to meet that demand. The most successful businesses do this, but relatively inexperienced business people do not. And that's true in the drug market.
What are you saying about the music industry, Cirque?
Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty bold assertion.
Yeah, like if Coca-Cola could sell 2x the amount of Coca-Cola that they do now tomorrow because demand has increased that much, they would adjust their supply chain as rapidly as possible. They would figure out how to squeeze every last dollar out of it. The music industry does not. Except Taylor Swift. Like Taylor Swift's doing a pretty good ass job of squeezing every last dollar out of the outsized demand she has.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's probably some missing places. Taylor Swift, if you're listening to this, let's talk. But so what can artists who are on the ground take away from what we're talking about here? What's actionable? There's the 1%, and then there's the rest of us. There's the indies that are out there trying to build businesses. And there's definitely stuff to take away from this sort of study on economics, I think, apart from, just the knowledge of how things operate and what black markets are like.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that, like, for a disenfranchised youth from a broken home in a mostly drug addicted city like myself, like, the excitement from drug dealing, and mostly like weed, came from the idea that like I could buy a product in bulk, wholesale, as one would say, sell it retail, and make the margin tomorrow. Right? It's something I could do. I could buy it today, and tomorrow I could be making margin. And I didn't need anyone's permission to do it. And I didn't need anything that I didn't already have, except for the money to buy it. And so it's a very exciting concept, is that, like, oh, I could start this now. I could be getting better at this now. I could be making money now. All business should feel like that. Starting businesses after college and after I wasn't like a vagrant homeless criminal, it's like, that was always, that excitement kept right up, is that, like, well, I can power through everything I need to actually get an offer out to market, and I could be transacting tomorrow. The same is true for artists. Like, to a degree, like, yes, you do have to build a fan base. You have to build demand around your product, but it's a lot easier to do that when you have the product to sell. And so, yeah, like, that's why we make such a hard beeline for, like, let's get an inventory, or let's do, there's the initial period is like, let's build up some demand. Let's test the market for whether they like the product. And drug dealers do that too. Like, in the shadier end of the black markets, like, hard drugs, like, they do that. They will go and put testers out into the market, and then they will create a demand for their product, and then they will sell it at full price. So it's a similar concept. But once you're past that, like, the impetus is on you to produce a product that can be sold, even if you're not sure that you will sell it tomorrow. Like just having the inventory is like, here is my margin. I got my inventory, and sitting within it, if I can just sell it, is all this margin. It's my profit. And that's an exciting feeling to have. And it should be what artists think about when they start up a business. Not your EIN, not your LLC, not your copyright registration. It should be like, I'm focused on the day when I have a stack of inventory and I can go sell it.
I'll be real for a second. Like, if those are the things that are stopping you from doing something with your music, man, it's like 2 hours worth of time. I've started a lot of businesses at this point. Getting an EIN and registering your business and even doing your copyright, 2 hours max. Like, if that's what's stopping you, you are lazy. Like, that's giving yourself an excuse.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not difficult to do, for sure.
No, and any head trash about, not knowing the right answers to put on the piece of paper, you'll be fine. You'll figure it out. So if that truly is the thing that's blocking your way, like, I promise you can get it done in like 2 hours, or just ask ChatGPT to help you at this point. There's plenty of websites that will do it for you for really, really cheap. This is really interesting. It reminds me of a story, a black market of sorts, and the rush of entrepreneurial blood that you feel when starting a business and bringing an offer to market and seeing sales and seeing that first win, that taste of blood. It reminds me of a story. A friend of mine in high school, he was reselling tickets to a local dance. There was a dance at an athletic center by me where I grew up, it was a big super gym, and they would have dances for high school kids. And they were like the cool dance to go to. Everybody wanted to go to it. They had artists come in and, take the stage and DJ and shit like that. And this guy, Jamie, he decided to start reselling tickets as they would go really fast. So he was flipping tickets. And then, which, wasn't allowed. He was a freshman in high school. He wasn't allowed to be doing that by, the organizers of this event certainly didn't want him to do it. Then he started selling counterfeit tickets and made a lot of money until he got caught and got in a lot of trouble. But that was the first, and I was probably a junior in high school when I watched this guy, Jamie, do this. He's one of my brother's best friends, great guy. And I saw for the first time in someone else, I think, as a teenager, like that entrepreneurial spark of like, oh, like, look at what I'm doing. I've got I've got something that people want, or I'm faking having something that people want in his case, which it eventually devolved to. And watching that happen was just really funny. And it's very similar, like black market kind of stuff going on, very deregulated. And yeah, really interesting. The fun entrepreneurial stuff, watching that play out in somebody's eyes. He got the nickname Tickets by my dad, and he still calls him that to this day. But yeah, same kind of thing.
Yes. And that same thing happens counterfeiting is something you only see happen when demand is high and or supply is low. You do not see counterfeiting of things that have an excess supply and a low demand ever. Counterfeiting is really only worth it when the demand is outsized for the supply. And it happens in the drug markets as well. It's sandbagging.
We lived through an interesting tipping point in the music industry, I think. This is another story that just got dragged up from the recesses of my brain. But I remember when I was in middle school, this was right as like Napster and, all the peer-to-peer sharing platforms were coming around. And I remember a friend of mine at the time was burning CDs, like burning full albums of bands that we liked. And he would sell them to kids at school at a slight discount from what they could get them from at the record store. And he made tons of money doing this.
Yeah, great days.
That's a really interesting tipping point in the music industry, I think, to hone in on a little bit, because that was probably when supply in music was the last time that supply in music was different from how it is today.
I think another thing people really get wrong about the music industry today that you would know if you had grown up in the home of AA when I did, but the thing that people get wrong is they think that because there's so many artists out there, the market is diluted, and thereby, all these new songs coming online now that the cost of producing music has fallen to almost zero compared to where it was. And that counts as excess supply. But it doesn't. Dilutive supply is a way different concept. And people don't really realize that, which also in cryptocurrency markets, people say like, oh, won't Bitcoin get diluted because there's all these other cryptocurrencies? And it's like, no, that's not how it works. But people make that mistake all the time. So dilutive supply is when you have like a commodity and then you have a like commodity that's sort of similar, but doesn't have the same properties. They're just both part of the same category. Category expansion does not equal supply dilution. So yeah, like the music industry has myriad problems. And, as anyone who listened to this podcast for a while probably knows, like, I think it's actually contracting and will continue to contract, but it's not because of the excess supply. That's a misnomer. And so, like, for instance, if pick a drug, I'm an ecstasy dealer, right? And then all of a sudden, like, a whole bunch of analog drugs come on the market that aren't ecstasy, but they're drugs and people can buy them, right? When that happens, that doesn't mean that the people who buy ecstasy are going to stop buying it because there's all these other options now. It's like they like ecstasy, right? They're going to buy ecstasy. So that has almost zero impact compared to if, like, there was so much ecstasy around that it, like, all of a sudden, like, went to zero in terms of value. Like, that's way different. So yeah, like, that category expansion doesn't actually play into the supply demand imbalance. And that's evidenced by the fact that we still have superstars. Like, we would not have superstars if category expansion was dilutive, which it really isn't.
It's true. I think that is largely a misunderstanding in music, because how often do you see headlines that are like, there's this many songs uploaded to Spotify every single day. How are you going to stand out, kind of thing?
Yeah. Another, and you had brought this up when we were kind of doing the preamble for this show, is it's interesting to look at the regulated drug market as opposed to the black drug market, or the unregulated drug market, is that you can think of the music industry much like the regulated drug market, in that the cost to enter it has never been higher. the cost to enter the sort of, 1% of the music industry has never been higher.
It's your soul. That's the cost.
Yeah, except in the drug market, it's regulatory hurdles that make drug discovery more difficult, and then getting it through trials and all this stuff. So it's not a one-to-one comparison, but just to say that like the music industry is a heavily regulated market down to the root of it. Before the product is even created, it must be given regulatory scrutiny to then pass into the realm of like a product, a piece of property that can be sold and then transferred, right? And when we sell music, we're really selling a license to it. It'd be like if Pfizer, like if you could print pills at your house and all you had to do was rent a license from Pfizer to print this certain, molecule.
Right. 3D printing drugs.
Yeah, it's like that.
Basement.
But you see the same. So it's like there is, once you make it past all those clinical trials, like there are traders on the stock market who literally just like scan pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials and then just purchase like massive put options, basically betting that the stock is going to go down around when the trials are supposed to end, because like 99% of trials end up getting rejected, right? They fail to pass that point. So, but once they do pass that point, they enjoy insanely outsized demand, for successful drugs. And the supply is never been lower or never will be lower, because for a period of time after they pass clinical trials and they get their patent, they have the sole right to make that drug in the entire world, right? So the only person who can make it. So literally their production capacity is the supply.
Yeah. And this is how they control price.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's legal antitrust. It's legal anti-competitive behavior. Regulated.
Thanks a lot, intellectual property rights.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how the music industry behaves on that basis. But like indie artists, you're not in the pharmaceutical industry. You're in the black market. Buy a bag and start selling it. That's really what the message is.
Yeah, it's true. I love this topic. I love this topic so much.
It's pretty spicy.
Well, I think at the core of it, why I love it so much goes back to that, like, taste of blood, entrepreneurial sort of gut instinct that people like you and I have felt. And I felt it from like the minute that I started making music too, or putting music out, I remember like selling shirts for the first time at my band's shows growing up, and selling CDs for the first time. And that same feeling existed. I never copyrighted shit. We didn't have a business. We were selling CDs out of a box and had a cash box with us that we threw in my mom's van when we would drive home,
Yeah, you can kind of see an analog in holistic medicines. Like the record labels of the world are your pharmaceutical industry. They paid insane costs to get their product to market, which is it's all in marketing. It's not in regulatory clearance and hurdles and patenting and clinical trials and drug discovery. It's all in marketing. Specifically the type of marketing that makes a product seem like it's the most popular thing in the world, even though there was no organic climb in demand. So, a new artist will hit the scene and be on every talk show and be on every radio station, boom, 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 boom. And all of a sudden you feel FOMO. You're like, how did I not know about this artist? And that's the intention. That's what the music industry does. So that's their clinical trials. Getting an artist through clinical trials when they actually believe that this artist will be a big thing, they will dump insane marketing dollars behind it, all tacked onto the bill of the artist and what they have to recoup.
We've talked about this plenty on the show, that like so often the only objective of music marketing at the 1% level is to make someone appear more popular than they actually are. And by doing that, they influence public opinion to actually make it so.
They manufacture outsized demand. Yeah. Yeah. And they're really good at it too. That's not to say that they're not. Like, if you recognize it for what it is, it's an impressive feat. If you think it's like building a fan base, it's not. It's building a mania. It's building a household name. It's building a media spectacle. And they're good at it. They're very efficient at it for that purpose. But you have to realize what game they're playing. So the record industries are like the pharmaceutical industry in that way. couple of big power players that have the money to get something to market like that. So like the regulated drug market is sort of like the record label music industry. And indie artists are a lot more like the black market, but there's another market that you can be like, which is like holistic medicines. You do not need regulatory approval to come out with a sugar pill that's bathed in water that once had some rose in it. I remember when a friend of mine was having a personal issue that they sought like a treatment for outside of the medical system. And they had bought a shitload of sugar pills.
Homeopathic.
Yeah. And the argument that this industry makes is that, well, these sugar pills are coated with a film of water. The water was filtered through this other thing we put in it, like rose or like some herb. And water has a memory is the argument. The water has a memory, and so that molecule that was in it will somehow have an effect on you. Anyways, point being is that they're able to go out there and convince the public that this thing will have an impact on their ailments, on their maladies. And so through their own direct marketing, they're able to make the argument that this thing is actually better than the pharmaceuticals that you would get, right?
Mm-hmm. I see where you're going with this.
See what I'm saying is that like through a direct conversation, it's actually a lot simpler to make your case to an individual buyer that what you've got is something they want to buy. Now, I disagree with the ethics of like homeopathic remedy providers. I don't think you should be like them necessarily. But what I'm saying is that you do not have to pass these insane monetary hurdles and regulatory hurdles to get your product to market and make a profit off of it. And do so in a way that's copacetic. You can take your product and make an argument on its merits, but you have to do it more individually. You can't convince an entire marketplace to buy it. You have to convince individuals to buy it.
For sure, yeah. And, I think what's interesting here, and going back to what you were saying about how the music industry orchestrates outsized demand, is what you have to realize in a statement like that, or what artists need to realize in saying something like that, is related to what you just said about you can't influence a market to buy everything. What the record industry isn't influencing an entire market audience to buy something. In most cases, they're just influencing their opinion of it. Some subset will then buy, but it's not like they're getting swarms of customers with every flooded ad that they're running across every channel that you can imagine.
Yeah. The point being is that a lot of artists, they don't know that they're thinking this, but what they're thinking is, if I can't convince the entire market to want my product, then I can't sell it. And that's not true. You just have to be a better salesperson. You have to convince the entire market if you want to like wait around and not really hustle to like go deliver the product. If you want to be lazy, yeah, you can afford to be lazy if you have that kind of outsized demand. But you can still succeed if you go directly and sell it and you actually try to sell it.
And you can do well, and you can build a successful business for yourself.
Yeah. And I know that this is like, some might listen to this episode and be like, isn't this a long-winded rehashing of what you guys always say? It's like, yeah, maybe.
I can live with that.
Trying to provide different angles on it so that it might shake something loose for you. Is that like, oh shit, I can go buy an inventory and then go try to sell it. And it's like, if I try my ass off, like, let's say I get into a position where nobody wants my product and now I've paid for it and I have this inventory sitting and that's a hole in my wallet and it's gone. It's not gone because you like through sheer tyranny of will, you'll be able to move an inventory. Chances are while you're moving it, you'll get better at moving it. You'll get better at selling, and you might recognize like things about your product that you can make better. And so like just the mere act of selling is actually a self-fulfilling like virtue. Like just going out there and having to sell something not only makes you better at selling it, but makes you understand what customers want most, makes you understand how to communicate with people, makes you understand how to augment your product to make it more sellable. And the quickest way to get really good at selling something is just to go out there and be bad at selling it.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think something that artists can take away from this, in addition to, looking at sort of the philosophies that we espouse and talk about on this show and the strategies that we talk about around that, is you can go and, like you said, you can get an inventory and go sell it. And you can continue from there to try and spin out new ways of selling it, create new angles, create new offers, price differently, go to different people and try to sell it. And it really is like, in a way, every time you try that, like you said, Cirque, you're going to get better at it for the next swing. And I think that's really important. And also, the first time you might try to sell something, it might absolutely bomb. And that's okay. Like, how many businesses have been started off, how many successful businesses have been started off of the backs of unsuccessful offers? So many tries.
Yeah. So hopefully this was a lesson to you. Hopefully you learned a little bit about supply and demand and how markets work. You learned a little bit about capitalism and regulation. You learned a little bit about the pharmaceutical industry, and you learned a little bit of, hopefully a lot, about why the music industry is so weird and why there is such a heavy imbalance between the haves and the have-nots in the music industry.
Yeah, this was fun. And hopefully you learned a little bit about us and some of our fun stories.
Yeah.
I hope you guys dug this. This has been another episode in our 2023 wrap-up series. So we'll catch you guys next time on Creative Juice. We'll see you then.
Peace out, yo.
Peace.
Can y'all really feel us? East Coast, feel us. West Coast, feel me. Say what?